Welcome to session 7 of the study on Jesus in Matthew. And today, the end of chapter 24 and all of chapter 25, 4 parables of the kingdom. So to lead in today, a little recap. This material should be familiar to you. We have seen that the Matthean community probably began as a community of messianic Jews, because of their belief that Jesus was the Messiah who had come into their midst. They were ostracized and persecuted by other Jews, seemingly including their families, according to some verses. They persisted in their synagogues and operated as a group under Jewish authority, but this just intensified their difficulties because the difference between this community and the synagogue authorities of the time was such that it was based on the fact that the authorities did not recognize Jesus as the promised Messiah. So initially, at least, the mission of people in this community was understood as being not particularly to Gentiles, but exclusively to other Jews. They claimed to be following the commands of Jesus to go nowhere among the Gentiles, enter no town of the Samaritans, go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And this brought them into more conflict with the authorities. In Matthew's gospel, as in Mark and Luke and John, Jesus debates with the Pharisees. He particularly debates in the synoptic gospels about how to interpret Torah, the law. And we have seen that his debates contain a number of significant Jewish features, particularly when he uses Hebrew scripture to promote his point of view, and he uses other rabbinic techniques, asking a question and answering a question with a question, etc. But we have seen that in this gospel, Gentiles are not given a blanket exclusion, because if they do show faith, they may well be included in the kingdom. There's just a couple of stories, chapter 8 and chapter 15. We looked at the chapter 15 one, the Canaanite woman, that indicate this. And there's a parable of Jesus that we're not looking at today, but that's the parable in chapter 21. There are 24 parables in Matthew's gospel, so trying to do all of them in a course of this length is a bit difficult, but we've done our best. But this particular parable concludes with a warning that if the Jews continue to refuse to accept Jesus as Messiah, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. So the Jewish authorities to whom Jesus was speaking at this time heard this as a great threat. They perceived he was talking about them. And then indeed, in a subsequent chapter, in chapter 23, Jesus issues a string of warnings and denunciations to the scribes and Pharisees, and they are seen to be outside the kingdom. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, he says 7 times. He says that the Pharisees are children of hell. They do not go into the kingdom. When others are going in, you stop them, he says. They are full of greed and self-indulgence. They are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness, anomias. We've seen that word. So he concludes, how can you escape being sentenced to hell? So the Pharisees in this gospel come in for quite a drubbing from the mouth of Jesus, which is in contrast to what Josephus says about them later in the centuries, that the Pharisees enjoyed the support of the masses and that they talk about regulations handed down, not recorded in the laws of Moses. That's the oral tradition that we've seen in that debate in Matthew chapter 15. Now, of course, in Mark's gospel and indeed in Luke's gospel, Jesus has criticized the Pharisees. But in Matthew's gospel, all of those criticisms are there and more. He has really intensified this in chapter 23. And then he proceeds on immediately in chapter 24 to talk about the end of the age, the so-called apocalyptic discourse. That is when the beginning of the birth pangs happen. It will introduce a time of great suffering. Vultures will be hovering around a corpse. A cosmic eclipse will take place, and Jesus, in order to prepare his disciples for what is to come, Jesus ends this long final section of teaching with instructions to keep awake and be ready, because about that day and hour, no one knows, only the Father. So these final set of 4 parables all come after this long development from the parable in chapter 21 about the kingdom being taken away from the Jewish leaders, to chapter 23, the long excoriation of the scribes and the Pharisees as hypocrites, to chapter 24, talking about the cataclysm that's going to happen. And then Jesus says, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. And so he tells these 4 parables, warning people to keep awake, to be ready. All of which leads to the obvious first question for your pondering. How do you respond to this picture, which Matthew takes from Mark, but intensifies and expands and develops? This intense, fiery Jesus focused on the imminent coming of the end of the ages. And indeed, what do you do with the reality that what he says in verse 34, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place, was not in fact what happened, because we're here 2,000 years later and the generation has well and truly passed away. So 2 questions here about the fiery apocalyptic Jesus and about the lack of fulfillment of this particular saying of Jesus.
There we go. Challenged. Anyone want to talk about what was challenging?
We had some discussion over the fact that the Gospels has been written fairly soon after the destruction of the temple, so it must have looked as if the end of the world was beginning, or at least the end of the Jewish world.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment, Ian. I think that throughout history, there's been things that have happened, like the destruction of the temple, the plague, wars, incredibly dreadful things, and it's been interpreted as the end of the world, because that's what it looks like from where people are sitting, that, you know, how else could you explain these terrible things that are happening? So
Matthew 25 has Jesus saying, they point to the temple and say, look at this wondrous building, and he says, I tell you, not one stone will be left upon another. And that's something that actually witnessed. So he got that right, but then the end of the world didn't happen. So that was something he got wrong.
Yeah, well, we talked about that too, from the perspective that there are different Jesuses in the gospel. There is a human Jesus, and yet the church, has over the years invested untold amounts of money on buildings that indicate that Jesus is coming again and the end of the world is going to come, just as the gospel says. And that's totally incompatible with what has actually happened. So there's either a willful blindness to the way the gospel writers have portrayed Jesus, and none of them being exactly the same anyway, to the and focusing entirely on what Paul has had to say, and build your churches and cathedrals, etc., around that, and the edifices of Christianity, which seems to be based on something such as Matthew's written that didn't happen. So it's almost incompatible.
Margaret, I think I don't think it'd be willful blindness, because like, there's not just the destruction of the temple, but there's like a war on Jews and people.
Oh, yeah.
And people are being killed. And according to Borg, the whole population is quite drastically reduced. So in that circumstance, your idea of the future might be a little bit grim.
Oh, totally agree, but that's not the way it has been seen over the last few thousand years. I agree with Borg, and I agree with what John and Elizabeth are saying. Our comments were not from me, but from others who were saying, but that is not how it has been seen over the years.
Yeah.
Isn't this rapture theology, it's only about a couple of 100 years old at the most, isn't it? There's the point that's very keen, or a lot of fundamentalist churches are very keen on this rapture theology.
Yeah, there's not a lot of New Testament basis for it. There's a few verses that people into that kind of understanding garner up, like in Revelation, and say that this is what it means, but it's dubious at best, I would say.
It's easy to write, after the event of the destruction of the temple, it's easy to write, oh, there was a prophecy of this, Jesus prophesied this, and I'm not very, I'm not certain if that couldn't have been the case.
Yes, hindsight is a wonderful thing, and it's very easy to write prophecy about something you know has indeed happened. So I think that most of the prophets do that kind of thing. But remember, if you've done our course on the prophets, you would remember that prophets aren't there to predict the future necessarily, though they sometimes do. Prophets are there as kind of theological commentators to interpret the happenings that are going on at the time.
I know, but there are churches which I think take the Pauline view that, or something, that if what a prophet says doesn't happen, then that he's a false prophet, or say something like that.
Well, they'll be throwing out half the Old Testament.
I agree, prophecy means speaking the truth to power, but
yes, yes, that's definitely what it is. And Paul himself expected to see Jesus coming because he says it. Yeah. He tells us in his letters that's what he says, and we know he didn't get that right either. So there was clearly an expectation in the first 50 years of the first century that Jesus would be coming back, and he would be coming back with trumpets and angels, and it would be the day of the Lord, and this judgment was going to happen. And clearly that just didn't happen. So then you start to get stories arise about why it might be delayed, or why might things be different now. And of course, by the time of Constantine, you have the establishment of basically a state religion and the rise of Christendom at that point. And all of these interesting sayings of Jesus about apocalypse and coming back in the generation of the disciples, well, they're not really. What's important at that point is doctrine and heresy and how you run the church.
And also, I mean, that influences the selection of what goes into the canon.
Of course there is. And they picked what went in.
So should we be restricted to the canonized gospels? I mean, it's certainly interesting to see some of the other gospels, especially the ones that develop and say, oh well, look, this is what happens into the sanctification of Mary. You see the progress in the gospels through to the, what's it, Josephus or something, some gospel like that, and how she became
a tool to suppress women. Is that what you're trying to say?
No, I'm not saying a tool to suppress women, but it's to convert Mary from being an ordinary person into being a person who never ever sinned.
Yeah, that's
the gospel of James that starts that trajectory, and then there are other gospels later on that do that. Yeah, but second, third, fourth, fifth century.
Yeah, they're quite late, these ones. Elizabeth, you had a question.
Yeah, I find personally that the challenge is that when these things didn't happen, and I don't like some of the comments anyway, and in chapter 25, and some of those horrible pictures of fiery furnaces and whatever.
Yep.
The challenge for me is not to toss it all out because I don't like the picture, or it hasn't happened. And I think Enid made the point in our group that, sort of what we need to do is take from it what we can, not to be hypocritical, in our actions, and that idea of faith and actions going together, so do we just extract from this what we feel comfortable with, or, you know, or is that not the, you know, is that not kosher, if you like?
I think it's important to wrestle with the difficult passages of the Bible. Quite often we leap over them. The lectionary is unhelpful because it'll leave out the nasty bits and start with a chapter and end it with a chapter and leave out everything in between. I think that it's good to wrestle with the difficult texts that we have. And by understanding historically what's happening, by understanding the context of what's going on, I think that we can get an idea of maybe why Matthew wrote the way he did. And yes, take away from it the things that we think are reasonable to understand faith or its development.
I was just going to say that, if I may, that Luke also talks about being alert and whatever. And
Yes,
of course,
he
then
does.
we've got the book of Revelation, you know, whoever wrote that. So there are pointers to, you know, sort of second comings and, you know, sort of there's a you can't just say it's just Matthew.
No, it isn't just Matthew. What we have in Matthew, though, is this second coming was meant to happen while the disciples were alive, which clearly it didn't. That's the problem there. You can still believe that a second coming might be on the horizon, but it didn't happen in the timing that Paul and Matthew, and indeed probably Mark, expected it to.
So let's push on into parables 1 and 2 in this section of 4 and pick up some of what we've been saying already. These parables warn about complacency and encourage active discipleship. And the first two of them specifically warn about the delay that's happened, contrasting the faithful and wise slave with a wicked slave, and the second parable contrasting the wise bridesmaids with the foolish bridesmaids who are rejected. The wise bridesmaids go into the wedding banquet, the door is closed. The foolish bridesmaids hear Jesus say, "Truly, I tell you, I do not know you." So active waiting is what is encouraged, active discipleship, being about God's business in the here and now, knowing that something is going to happen unexpectedly, if you like. Be prepared for the kingdom. But these parables have punishments, which is a rhetorical strategy to get people to pay more attention, perhaps, to the message of the parable. The first parable ends with Jesus saying, "Put him with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And we've seen the weeping and gnashing of teeth in earlier parts of the gospel. And we've seen outer darkness in some places as well. We also have here these. I've got a string of quotes from Hebrew scripture about the wicked gnashing their teeth. It seems that this was something that was associated with being persecuted by opponents. The prophet who wrote Lamentations laments that when Jerusalem is ransacked, all your enemies open their mouths against you. They hiss, they gnash their teeth, they cry, "We have devoured her." Well, you know very well from history and from prophets and from Lamentations that they're not only saying things, but they did terrible things. They completely devastated the city of Jerusalem. But these are kind of symbolic actions associated with that massive destruction. But the first parable has a saying, a part in it that we can't ignore, that the wicked slave is to be cut into pieces and put with the hypocrites, where there
What's
will be
left of him.
weeping and gnashing of teeth. And this, in Hebrew scriptures, there are a couple of places where animals are cut in pieces as a sign of making, as part of making a covenant. But there's also some terrible stories where sinners are cut in pieces. The terrible story of the Levite's concubine in Judges 19, one of Elizabeth's favourite passages.
It is not one of my favourite passages. It's an interesting passage, and she wasn't the sinner, the Levite was.
Well, yes, but as a sign of the sin, she is cut in pieces. Saul defeating the Ammonites there's cutting in pieces, direct prophetic warnings in other prophets. So this is a terrible end for the unprepared slave. So this is the question that Elizabeth Cowan was pushing towards. How do we understand this terrible language, this language of judgment, this language of destruction in these parables? And the suggestion in the question is, or to invite you to think, in what ways does understanding how the language of judgment and punishment is used in Hebrew scriptures help us to understand this parable? And that, of course, brings up the whole context in which Hebrew scriptures came to have their shape as we know it. For those of you who've done earlier courses, we've looked particularly about how the Old Testament is drawn together in the exile and after the exile, after that really terrible experience of being conquered and sent into it, captured and taken into exile. So judgment and punishment in Hebrew scriptures, does that help us? How might that help us deal with these parables of Jesus? Because we know that Matthew makes much use of Hebrew scripture in his writing. Okay.
Can I just ask a question about this? And tell me if I should wait for the group. But how does the change of attitude of, where it says, no longer, the sins of the fathers are visited on the children to the generation, where it's much more of a community center of sin, back to turn into this more individual Western approach of sinning being an individual's responsibility rather than a community responsibility?
I'm not sure Matthew isn't having a community responsibility. I mean, chapter 18 suggests that he does. I mean, individuals can certainly sin, but he talks about the sins of cities, the sins of different groups of people. So I don't think it is just individual.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I'm going to pop you in your breakout rooms when I find them. Where are they? So, anyone have any insights they want to share or any questions?
I just observed that in that final paragraph, that section, the person who's being cut in to pieces, we have a horror of dismemberment. It seems a particularly gross and severe punishment to inflict on anybody. And I made the observation from what I know of the war in New Guinea, Japanese soldiers who had mutilated Allied bodies at the end of the war were hanged for mutilating Allied corpses. So there's this horror of dismemberment and mutilating, transgressing against the sanctity of a dead human body that God has given us.
But the church in the past has sanctified, has accepted hang drawing and quartering to prevent someone being resurrected properly.
Yep, or torturing people to become Christians, changing their faith.
No, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
That's what I was referring to. Yes.
Yeah.
I think in this context, though, where there's a bit of a Holocaust going on and there's some dreadful things happening.
Yep.
Matthew draws upon the darkest images he can find to point to how the Jewish people or the leaders had been unfaithful to their calling to look after the kingdom, if you like. So it's really just trying to. I mean, I don't think this is a literal thing he thinks is going to happen, but rather it's a metaphorical way of describing the horror that is going to be drawn down upon people who have been unfaithful and not followed God's way.
Yes, he's certainly using those Old Testament images. And I mean, in the Old Testament, probably some of them were literal, but that doesn't mean that writers at this time didn't use rather a lot of hyperbole to actually, make their point.
That's his tools, isn't it?
Yes,
right.
it is.
Well, isn't it just a continuum of, sort of, it's the scriptures that were available to Jesus and the people at the time. And this is just picking out bits and pieces from whether it's the Psalms or Kings or Samuel. And it's just a continuum of the same sort of punishments for wickedness.
Yep.
Yes. Yep, that's right. So if you think that the God of love of the New Testament, nobody writes about punishments and things, think again. Matthew would beg to differ.
And
Could
I mean, it's
I
not so many centuries ago we had done.
One at a time. John, then Ian.
I just reminded of Dante's descriptions of hell, which I'm not too familiar with, but that was all right for people in their times. They were quite happy with that. Was that the Divine Comedy?
Yes, that's right.
And so whereas we think, no, that the hell that he described as is awful, people in that time say, well, this is what it's like.
Well, Dante took it to new levels, I think. He grabbed what was going on here and he developed all sorts of interesting tortures, which he didn't like popes. He had an awful lot of popes in there. I've read the Divine Comedy, and the hell bit was quite fascinating, actually, about who he had in there and how they were in there and what was going on. Ian.
Just picking up on the point that John made earlier about hanging, drawing and quartering, which was a point that Sue made in our group. To that you can add the burning of heretics, which was a custom of the church for many centuries.
Yes.
And they both did it. The Catholics did it to the Protestants. The Protestants did it to the Catholics. And one thing I will never forgive John Calvin for is having one of these young acolytes who was so bold as to disagree with him. He had him burnt at the stake. So the church has many, many sins of burning for which it should seek forgiveness.
Yes, I would agree, Ian. We tend to think we live in dreadful times, and in some ways we do. But the times we have now are nothing compared to the cruelty from ancient times through to now.
But don't you also, Elizabeth, think that perhaps part of what Ian's talking about and others come from a literal reading of the scripture as opposed to one with understanding?
Oh, probably, but it's also what was present at the time. I mean, the tortures of the Middle Ages weren't biblical. I mean, they might have justified them by saying in the biblical text, clearly people are punished in various ways, but they had their own ways of disposing of people, which were far more cruel than anything we do nowadays.
Yes.
And they just found texts which would sort of justify it. So
I think the tortures we have today are pretty wicked.
They are, but when you look at research, it shows that things have actually improved, believe it or not.
I don't think if you're being tortured, you'd say it's improved.
It really has. Researchers have done a lot of work with this. The sort of attitudes towards torture and death and harming people that we find prevalent right up until modern times were far more dreadful than anything we're doing now. We still do dreadful things, but they tend to be in little pockets, not a whole village turning out to burn 6 witches, for example.
Well, that's true. That's true.
So believe it or not, things have improved in that sense, but you can justify anything. If you want to hang, draw and quarter someone, if you want to impale them, if you want to put them on a rack, you can justify anything by finding some text that says the wicked will be punished, and there you go.
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying.
That's right. So,
But don't you think that something like Hiroshima or the present time when the Russians are bombing with their rockets, housing as opposed to military targets is just as cruel and unpleasant?
Of course it's cruel and unpleasant, but we don't have the same attitude among a multitude of humans that we used to have. For example, in medieval times, a form of entertainment was to put a cat in a cage and gradually lower it into flames, and people would weep with laughter as it howled in pain. We don't do stuff like that now. Individuals might, but that isn't entertainment like the Colosseum was.
Oh, I beg to disagree. We send people out onto football fields to smash each other up and call it entertainment.
Go for it, Margaret.
Yes, we do, but that is not the Colosseum. It's not being pulled apart by wild bears, and we don't expect them to actually kill each other.
No, but they're maimed for life, many of them. And we call that fun.
We do, but they choose to do it. I'm talking about things that are deliberately cruel. It's cruel in a sort of inadvertent way. No one goes out there to get a concussion. No one goes out there with the idea that they're going to come off with broken bones. There are risks that they take.
We're focusing a lot on all these bad consequences and things, but I think sort of missing the point about here, what's the point of the parable?
Yeah,
rather
you're
than
right, Bill.
things that are going to happen to people who ignore the will of God. So
that's right.
Yeah.
How do we respond to that part of the question?
And that moves us on, thank you, Bill, into the next parable, where that is there alongside, in equal measure, alongside the negative. So the negative is punishment, being cast into the outer darkness, but the positive for those that do use their talents well is to enter into the joy of your master. There's a little explanation in the resources about talents as a measure of weight, which is why it's worth 3,000 shekels, because you take 3,000 shekels to make 1 talent. It's an awful lot of money in Matthew's version of the parable. But when we look at them side by side, as you have in your resource material, you can see it's very much the same story, but there are multiple points of difference between the 2 versions. In Luke's version, it's a nobleman who's been away on a business trip who comes back. In Matthew, it is the owner of the vineyard who has gone away. And after a long time, the master of those slaves came back and settled accounts with them. So Matthew inserts into the parable the delay, the long time in coming back. And he also highlights that being active in discipleship means doing works, not just having faith. So he has said, Jesus has said in the gospel, by their fruits you will know them. And so entering the kingdom requires work as disciples. If you don't do that, you are cast out. But if you do, you are entered, you're welcomed into the joy of the master. So it is doing that is important, not saying. The question here is to my cursor.
Has Matthew got the parable of the workers, you know, where the sort of owner comes out and gets the workers at different times in the day, and they're all, or was that in Luke?
That's in Matthew.
Because that's almost diametrically opposite to this.
That's right.
I think Matthew's saying that you can repent up to the last minute.
Right.
This is what's going to happen if you don't.
Okay. Right.
Just in case, but, you know, he hasn't made it clear enough.
What I find difficult here is that in Matthew, the fear is being seen as laziness, whereas the fear in the Luke passage is seen as being, you know, an enemy rather than.
Well, certainly laziness in the sense in Matthew that you're not doing the work of the kingdom, that you think when the master's not looking at you, you can do what you like, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, but in the Luke passage, it's all about, you know, we don't want you as our king.
No, they didn't. It was interesting, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's, you know, it's quite a different context.
Yes.
You know, and the punishment is your enemy, because you're enemies of mine. It's not that you're lazy and you didn't do anything with your talent.
Yeah. No, Matthew's got a different emphasis. It's about working for the kingdom. And if you're not working for the kingdom, what are you doing, basically? Yeah. Any other comments on that before we go looking at husbandry with sheep and goats?
Go to the sheep and goats.
Have you got some other comments? Or John?
About this?
Yeah, about the significance of the differences.
Don't invite her.
I just observed that I've always felt a bit of sympathy for the third servant, the bloke in the ground. He's accused of being lazy and wicked, perhaps lazy, but not wicked. He actually didn't go and spend the talent on having a good time for himself.
No.
He was able to hand it back to his master intact. So at least he was honest.
And he's not a risk taker.
No, he's not a risk taker. Here we have a salutary lesson for our churches. If you don't take risks, you will not get rewards.
That's interesting.
That's what I'm taking from this parable, and I'm sticking to it.
Mm-hmm.
With risks come rewards. I think that's what's saying. If you risk for the kingdom, there'll be rewards. Where if you remain in fear all your life, not only will there not be rewards, you'll probably end up being punished because you didn't show the fruits of your faith, if you like. Mm-hmm. Matthew is a harsh taskmaster. He really is. And we don't tend to read these bits of them. You know, when these parables come up, we'll head for the Lucan version in the lectionary rather than the Matthean one, because Luke's much nicer and kinder, mostly. Not always, but mostly. All right, we're going to move on to the sheep and the goats now, which is a really, really interesting parable that's found only in the Gospel of Matthew. And here we have Jesus turning up on a cloud with angels and trumpets and all the trappings that one would expect for the final day of judgment. And before him are the nations. The word is ethnoi, and it's used in the Septuagint and in this gospel to describe non-Jews. They're all lined up in front of Jesus on his cloud with his angels. And he gives a long speech to them about who is condemned and why, and who is going to heaven and why. So we find things like they're like the general justice laws of the Jews. So if you're hungry and you give someone food, if they're thirsty, you give them water. If they've got no clothes, you give them clothes. If they're sick, you look after them. You visit them in prison. You welcome the stranger and the alien. They're quite Old Testament concepts. You can find them in places like Isaiah 58 and also scattered through the prophets in different ways. But the interesting thing that Matthew's put on this is he said that if you do this to any of these people, these least, these little ones, these lesser beings, if you like, is almost what the Greek says. If you do this to them, it's just like doing it to me. So when you give a beggar a cup of cold water, it's the same as if you gave me a cup of cold water. And then you've got this oppositional corollary where those who are not blessed, they're the opposite, they're cursed, and they're thrown into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And it's the opposite. I was hungry and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink, etc. So we have a complete mirroring here, but we've got you did not do these things. And then it says, truly, I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. So this is a really unique story or narrative we have here in the Gospel of Matthew. It's very unusual. It's unique for using sheep and goats to be the symbols of righteous and unrighteous, or just and unjust. It's unique in how it defines righteous and just. It picks up the earlier parables. So by the time that we reach this particular one, it's very, very clear where Matthew is standing on sin, judgment, and punishment, at least as how Gentiles are concerned. And the really astounding thing about this parable is you will read it until your eyes fall out, but you will not find the word faith in it anywhere. This is all about what you do. You are judged on these good deeds to your poorer fellow human beings. And by doing so, you minister to Jesus himself, and on the basis of your actions or lack of actions, you will receive an eternal reward or an eternal punishment. So it's not about those who follow Jesus. It's not about belonging necessarily to a Christian community. It's not about faith. It's about prerequisites being how you live your life, if you like. So that's really quite unique in the New Testament, I'm going to put to you. We don't have anything else like this anywhere in the other Gospels or in the epistles. And we find Jesus yet again deliberately identifying with the powerless, the weak, the despised, those who are oppressed generally, the world's outcasts, if you like, the poor. And he's asking people to minister to them. We would say we minister to them out of our faith, though it doesn't actually specify that in this. He's teaching a lesson that, you can find Christ in anybody, a lonely neighbour, somebody who's sitting on the street who's homeless, somebody who's in prison, somebody who does without and is poor. So it's about identifying with the pain, if you like, of people who sit on the margins. So it's quite a strange parable in many ways. And as well as the judgment it contains, the basis for the judgment is really odd compared to the rest of the New Testament. So we want you to think about this oddity, if you like. How do you respond to the fact that there isn't faith involved in this judgment? Who do you think is being judged if you want to go down that pathway? And how important is it to you to act in the way that's encouraged in the parable of the sheep and the goats? Does that define what our faith is today? Is it more than that? Is this enough? So these are all immensely ponderable questions that we'd like you to think about in your groups.
There is something in one of the Gospels about not being our place to separate the sheep and the goats, isn't there? It's like we're not to separate the wheat from the chaff, and we're not to separate the sheep from the goats, which I think is sort of a pastoral thing about not excluding people.
I don't know where that is, John. I don't know. There is another reference to sheep and goats and not separating them. There certainly is one about wheat and weeds, but I think this sheep and goats is the only sheep and goats one we have running with us.
Oh, I'll have to check that. Maybe I've misremembered.
You may have done. And John and I did actually Google sheep and goats in the Bible just to double check they weren't lurking anywhere else, and we could not find them, other than saying Abraham had flocks of sheep and goats, which doesn't count because that's just part of a story. Okay. I'll pop you into your rooms. Breakout rooms. There we go. I'll just give you a few more minutes. There we go. Opening rooms.
Mm.
How did you go with the difficult sheep and the goats?
Well,
I start by saying that what I said to Mike is that notion of not doing it unto Jesus, you know, the least of these, his brethren, that to me is perhaps the most powerful part of all scripture.
Mm.
And it governs my own personal acts of charity and my interest in humanitarian good works.
Mm.
I also find it difficult to reconcile that attitude with St. Paul's emphasis on faith. Basically, all you need is faith.
Mm.
James, in his epistle, then denies and says, show me faith without good works, and I'll show you somebody who isn't in the kingdom.
Yep, that's pretty much it, Ian.
Yep.
Although I draw you to Corinthians 13.
Where Paul is being utterly sarcastic and giving the Corinthians a big dose of nasty rhetoric,
Yeah.
despite what brides and grooms thinking on their wedding days.
I'm reminded of the story in I think it's called Chassidic literature, when a student asked the rabbi, why did God create atheists? I don't know if you know that one.
No.
And he says, and the person said, well, it's to teach us the greatest thing of all, because when an atheist does good, he doesn't do it because he's frightened of punishment or because he believes God commanded him to do it. He does it out of the good, because he thinks that's the good thing to do. And so he said, whenever you encounter something where you have to be good, think like an atheist and do it because it's the right thing to do.
I think I think it was Ian who said this seems to be the opposite of Paul. It is. And I've said before that I think Matthew is actually thinly veiling his criticism of Paul because he doesn't agree with what he would see as cheap grace and requires a lot more than just faith.
So just comment there, Elizabeth. I think we need to keep in mind the chronology of the two writers to understand that, to, you know, give full weight to that statement that Matthew could well be a critique of Paul's writing.
Yes, Matthew's writing later than Paul. I believe he knows at least some of Paul's letters, and he is not in agreement.
Mm.
And you can, I mean, from the portrayal of the Matthean community that we've been developing in these studies, you can see, okay, they're sometime after Jesus. They believe Jesus is the Messiah. They've come into great difficulty because of that. They know of, perhaps even see in their own town, people who've encountered the message that Jesus is the Messiah, he is the Lord, and that circumcision is not required and that kosher food rules are not required, the kind of message that Paul was preaching. So they're seeing themselves under threat within their own religious tradition from their own authorities, and they're seeing the growing influence of this kind of renegade preacher looking at Paul from their point of view. So there's a kind of double whammy. Of course, they're not going to like him because of their own. Yeah.
Why don't you think there's faith in this? Why is faith not a requirement here? Has anyone got a theory about that?
Is it understood?
I'm going to say no.
Well, perhaps one explanation is that if you are a true believer, if you accept Jesus, well, of course you're going to do good works. It's I am a Christian, therefore I do good works.
Yes, though Matthew is big on faith in other parts of the gospel. And he criticizes people for not having enough faith or the right faith or the wrong faith or whatever. So what's going on that's different here? Because it is different.
Is it in contrast to the sort of mainstream Jewish authorities?
It's certainly in contrast to Jews. I said at the beginning to note who stands in front of Jesus. Who is standing in front of Jesus? Who is gathered when he arrives on his clouds with his trumpets? Who is it?
Righteous. The
No,
righteous.
it's not the righteous. They're both unrighteous and righteous.
The disciples.
The nations.
No, it's not the disciples.
All the nations.
It's the nations, yes. It's the ethnoi, the nations, non-Jews. It's non-Jews. So if non-Jews don't keep the law, how do you judge them on the last day?
Badly.
No.
By their
Rosemary.
works.
It is by their works, exactly,
By their
Elizabeth. By
So
their
if
works.
if they are in spirit working the same way as gospel, as the kingdom workers should be, then they're judged as okay.
Yes, this is a common thing in Jewish belief. If you look in the Old Testament, you'll find it there. By the time of Jesus, it was known as the Noahide laws, and it was believed Jews are very different to a lot of religions. They're not exclusive. They don't think they're the only ones going to heaven. They actually believe that non-Jews, Gentiles, also can go to heaven, but they're not judged on whether they keep the law and their righteousness in the same way. They're judged on how they live their lives. Do they live moral lives? Do they live kindly lives?
Well, that's what Paul says, doesn't he, in Romans?
Yes. But Paul wants to, I think Paul is mixed. Matthew doesn't mix up Jews and Gentiles, if you like, Elizabeth, where Paul does. He's got them all together, all following the same lack of law, where Matthew's saying, no. If you're Jewish and a disciple, you follow the law. You are under law. If you're Gentile and you don't know the law, that's okay. You can still go to heaven. You can still behave if you live the right kind of life. That is, you're kind to people and you do deeds of charity and you're moral, etc., etc. So Matthew is picking up on the Jewish belief of his time. And indeed, I think Jews still believe that today, that, you know, you don't have to be a Jew to go to heaven, but you have to live in a certain way that reflects, if you like, what Margaret says, the spirit of what God intended with the law. And that's what's happening here. And if you go back to chapter 18, I think it is, and also chapter 24, you will find comments about the 12 disciples sitting on thrones to judge the 12 tribes of Israel and the angels gathering up the elect, which is one of the rapture passages at the final day. It's only the nations who gather before Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew to actually be judged, though clearly the elect are separated from the unelect in the Jewish nation, and that is referred to in 18:4. So there appears to be two kind of judgments in Matthew, one for Gentiles, that is people who don't follow Jewish law, who may not know Jesus, and one for those who are Jews.
Elizabeth, just on that,
yep.
You know, when Jesus says, if you didn't do this to these brothers of mine, so is he specifically saying to fellow Jews, fellow believers?
I don't think so. I think he's just saying to the least of these people. I think it could be anybody. There is debate about that, Elizabeth. Some scholars do say it is about other Jews. So Gentiles are meant to be kind to Jews. I would probably, and there's a lot of debate about this. In fact, I've got a whole thesis, and the thesis is all it did was canvass the articles written about this parable. That was the thesis. And I own it, and it's actually signed by the writer because I ran into him and he couldn't believe that I was the first person and probably the last who ever asked him to autograph his book. But it was really interesting reading to see the amount of debate about that. and about who the least are and who and what's exactly going on.
Yeah.
I would say it's probably all humankind, but others would say it isn't.
Yeah, because I think, you know, the injunction to do this to brothers of mine sort of can sometimes be used as a cop-out.
Yes, that's right. We only treat our own well, exactly. I want to see it as a bit more universal, and that Matthew's not often universal. I want to give him the benefit of the doubt here and say, yes, he is being that way and not quite so narrow-minded. Any other comments or questions on this one? It is a very unusual thing. It's the only place in the New Testament you'll find people off to heaven and a reward of eternal delight with God for doing nice things to people without any other requirement. And maybe this is a big requirement. Maybe being nice to people most of the time is tough for us. I don't know. But anyway, my belief is there's actually two judgments. If you're a follower of Jesus and you're Jewish and believe he is the Messiah, you have a different criteria against which you'll be judged than the Gentiles.
I just thought, Elizabeth, this comes across as a carefully crafted piece of literature rather than something that might be spoken.
Yes.
So somebody sat down and written this very carefully and beautifully, maybe drawing on something that might have been said, but just amplifying it in this terrific way. So a lot of thought has been given into the construction of this piece of work.
Now, I think that's right, Bill. And Matthew uses a lot of repetition and a lot of Hebraisms, which means that his Jewish audience probably used to those kind of devices to remember. It is got that oral kind of content in it as well. But I agree, it is a literary construction. And it's very well constructed.
Many sermons have been written about this.
Many sermons have been written about this. Many theses and articles have been written about this, and I have the book to prove it. So, because people don't like it. Churches that follow Paul's line of teaching that you've got to, like give your heart to Jesus and through faith and grace you are saved kind of thing, they hate this passage. They really don't like it.
It fits snugly in the Uniting Church ethos.
It does fit very well into the Uniting Church ethos. It doesn't fit well into an evangelical ethos because there's no faith mentioned, you see, and that really upsets us. Where is the bit about giving your heart to Jesus? Where is the bit about having faith and receiving grace? Where's the bit about Jesus died to save us? It's not here.
Oh,
you're in heaven because you're nice to people.
And don't forget the Pentecostals and where's the gift of the Holy Spirit?
Well, that's right. It's all missing from this. And that's why it gives people who are evangelical and Pentecostal conniptions. But I love this passage. I'm with Ian. This is a great passage.
I think too, C.S. Lewis loved this one because in his Narnia series, in the very last book, he uses this one as the judgment. And I think I guess that's when it first dawned on me what it was about. So yeah, it's great.
It is a great passage.
Of relying on one passage as the basis for your faith, that we need to draw on
many
a picture to sustain our faith rather than
that's right, because there's writers that would absolutely not agree with the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament. They wouldn't, but I like to consider this as the antidote to Paul. Yes. Ian, did you want to say something?
Elizabeth, can I just say that now we're about to enter the 8th and final in the series of studies. My impression of Matthew is basically summed up in Matthew 10, the one where he says, "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword."
Yep.
In other words, strife and division.
That would be our Matthew. I love this gospel because I find it is what Bill said. It's a wonderfully constructed piece of literature with the really interesting ideas, and it's just steeped in Jewish tradition in the Old Testament. It doesn't mean I necessarily subscribe to Matthew's point of view in some cases. In terms of the study, I think John was going to put a proposition to you to extend it by a week. Do you want to talk about that, John?
In starting to prepare the material for the Passion narrative of Jesus, there's a number of Elizabeth's there's a number of important elements
that are unique to the Gospel of
that
Matthew
are unique
that
to the
need to be
Gospel of
looked at.
Matthew.
Yes.
And I thought also, we were thinking originally that a good way to finish off the series would be to look at the Bible Project's videos on Matthew, and I've looked at them, and there's 2 videos, so it's 15 minutes in total. So what we're thinking is that session 8 might become session 8A one week and session 8B the next week, if you are willing to extend for a week. The downside of that is it means that our last session will be on Elizabeth's birthday, and it'll mean she'll be working on her birthday night. But I'll organise a slap-up meal on another night to celebrate.
So what else is new, John? I frequently end up working on my birthday.
Yeah.
We can have a virtual birthday cake.
Yes, and it's my Beatles' birthday. I am 64 this year. All right, so if you're good with that, John, I'll send you out some for next week and some for the week after.
Well,
so we'll look at part of the Passion narrative next week, and then the week after we'll look at the Bible Project videos and finish the Passion.
Well, I'll send out the material for the Passion narrative, and we won't do it all in 1 week, so don't freak out when you get it. We'll take 2 weeks to do it.
Yeah, Matthew does have a lot of unique stuff in his Passion narrative, and I've insisted to John that we need to look at it. So